I'm going to cheat a bit. I know we don't have a great deal of time. I'm not actually going to tell you an awful lot about how to become an interpreter, all the competitions and tests and everything. Partly because I noticed at the careers fair there's a stand for interpreting for Europe, and they will tell you everything you need to know, really. If they can't tell you, they'll give you the website, and if the website can't tell you, they'll give you my email address, and then you'll write to me. What I really want to do today is try to persuade you that this is not just airy-fairy stuff reserved for a privileged few. That sort of ordinary people like thee and me can end up in Brussels. I was born in that exotic and cosmopolitan place, Bedfordshire. And I don't think there was a linguist in the family, except possibly for my grandfather, who was brought up speaking Welsh. Like I dare say a lot of you at university, I found I was simply better at languages than at anything else, which is another way of saying I was no good at anything else except languages. So naturally, when I came to university, I chose languages. I chose Sheffield because of the rock climbing. As soon as I tried it once, I realised I should join the rowing club, which is what I did. But so I came here and I studied languages. I did French and German. They didn't want me to. In fact, I didn't want to. I started out doing French and philosophy because I had these high-flying ideas about being intelligent. And I soon realised that wasn't right. So fortunately, they give you a second chance, or they did then. At the end of the first year, you could change your mind and do French and German instead, which is what I did. Learning languages wasn't quite as easy then as I think it is now. I didn't actually go abroad until I was 14, and that was on an exchange to Holland. And we went by train and boat. And the next trip was at the age of 16. I went to Paris, which was really very exciting, except we were on bicycles and camping. And after that, we went to Turkey. That was when I was 17. That was great. That was in a minibus. It took us 6 weeks. And then after I finished school, before I came to university, I went and worked in West Berlin, which was an interesting experience because this was obviously while the war was very much a reality. Just to make it more interesting and exciting, I worked in a department store selling suitcases to immigrant workers. But I certainly learned some German. And I'm afraid that's one of the messages I have for it. For all the talents one has, you've got to actually do some very hard work, and you've got to suffer. You've got to put yourself through that business of making a complete idiot, shall we say, to put it in polite terms, of yourself. Anyway, so there I was in Sheffield, and while I was here, I think it was 1973, the only time I ever voted in Britain was in the referendum on whether Britain should stay in the European community. It was at the time, and funnily enough, I voted yes. They've never let me vote since. I don't know why. But when I got to the end of my studies in Sheffield, I'm sorry if you've heard this story before, I've told it ad nauseam. I went to see the careers officer. A very nice lady, and I said, I need to find a job with my languages, and she said, yes, teaching. And I said, no. And she said, librarian? And I said, no. I said, translating, interpreting? She said, no. But in the end, she conceded that it might be possible. And I went off and did a course in Bath University, a postgraduate MA course in Bath. And the fellow who had the job I have now, which was head of the English interpreting unit, turned up at the final exams and said, I'll have you, you, and you. And he said to me, I'll have you, but we'd better train you a bit first. And this is because, quite simply, the UK had only just joined the community, and they were desperately looking for interpreters. I wouldn't say they were scraping the barrel, but they were pretty low down here. Anyway, I'm telling you all this not so that you'll sit there and say, well, didn't he do well? It's more, as I say, to try and demonstrate to you that you don't have to be the child of diplomats or to have grown up in a bilingual environment or travelling all over the world to become an interpreter at frankly, the highest level. I mean, I have worked for people, well, it depends on what you think of them, I suppose, but I have worked for people like Tony Blair and Chirac and all these people. It's quite funny to find yourself there. So, what do you need? Obviously, the first thing you will say you will need is languages. And as Angelique has just explained, there are all of these and more. We do cover, we think we can provide interpretation from pretty well any language if we're asked to. They're not all people on staff, obviously, but we can find pretty well any language in the world if called on to do so. But what's more important, funnily enough, than understanding or speaking other languages is understanding and speaking your own. Speaking your own very well, with a very good vocabulary, articulately, clearly. Not necessarily with an Oxford accent. We even have Americans working for us. But you do need to speak well. You need a capacity to analyse. Because when you're interpreting somebody, you're following their argument. You're not just repeating what they say word for word. You're trying to work out what they're saying, so you have to analyse the message. And I can tell you, they don't all work in a straight line. Some of the arguments are rather more like this. What we want you to do is produce something like this. And it takes practice, it takes training, but it does take the right sort of mind. You also want to avoid this. You can be the best interpreter in the world in so far as you can understand what's said, you can convert it into perfect English. But if you produce it in a sort of monotone that goes on and on like this in a dull voice, eventually everybody will stop listening to you. And I admire the delegates who didn't manage to sit in a room all day with headphones on and not fall asleep. It's an achievement. You need to be curious. I say you've got to be well informed. You've got to know what's going on in the world around you, or you can't do the job. Curious. They say curiosity killed the cat, and I think it's well on the way to killing this one. But it hasn't killed the interpreter yet. And you've got to have perseverance. You've got to have stamina. We had a crisis meeting about the Eurozone just the other week. They were there till 4 o'clock in the morning. You've got to be awake at 4 o'clock in the morning, preferably getting some of the figures right. Otherwise, you can end up with all sorts of trouble. And you need to be flexible. Not physically, as you can see, but you've got to be ready to drop what you're doing at the drop of a hat and do something different. You might think you're doing one thing tomorrow, it turns out you're doing something different. You might think you're in Brussels tomorrow, you'll end up being in Ouagadougou. You've got to be ready to change, and you've got to be able to follow somebody's thought processes. You've got to be able to switch from one way of thinking to another very quickly. And you've got to be ready to travel, which is why Angelique and me are going to slope off very quickly after the end of this, because I'm meant to be back in Brussels tonight. They only let me out for a day at a time. Worried I'll get into trouble. And lastly, you have to remain zen. You've got to be able to keep calm, because it is a stressful job. So there you are. Those are the qualifications. It's not beyond the abilities of a normal human being, I can assure you. I'm not saying everybody can become an interpreter, but you don't have to be superhuman. Look at me. There are jobs out there. We are looking for people precisely because they were desperately looking for staff in the late 70s, early 80s. And we took on an awful lot of people then. Those same people are about to retire. Hooray. And so we're going to need more people. In the next 10 years, I'm going to lose at least a third, if not more, of the people in my unit. And we'll lose a lot of freelancers we have as well. So there are job opportunities out there. And one last thing I'd say, even if you never become an interpreter, or a translator, or a lawyer linguist, learning languages is still a very good thing. Apart from the fact that I understand that people with a language degree find it easier to find a job than virtually anybody else, because they're more mature, you might not believe they're more mature, but you should see the others. They communicate better, they've got experience of an international multicultural environment, they are more employable. But apart from that, there's the sheer joy, the fact that you can go to another country, and rather than being the person sitting in a restaurant looking rather uncomfortable and not knowing what to order and not knowing what to say, you can be the one sitting under the olive tree in the sunshine, talking to the locals, drinking your pastis, and it's a different experience. That's all.